reflex is an involuntary and predictable response to stimulus. Stimulus is something that incites action or exertion or quickens action, feeling, thought, and etc. These discrete neural pathways which connect through the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, are involved in the performance of reflex act. Such nervous pathways are called reflex arcs. Most reflexes involve the brain, but some uses only the spinal cord. It is a negative effect circuit that is comprised of three main components. The first one is a sensory component or the afferent neuron. These neurons take in information and translate it to an electrical signal that gets sent to the central nervous system. The second one is integrating center or the interneuron. These neurons act as sensory processing centers that determine the magnitude of the response to the incoming stimulus. They are in the central nervous system, which is your spinal cord. The last one is the efferent portion or motor neuron that takes the information from the interneuron and sends it to the effectors, which activates a response. These effectors are usually muscle fibers, as in the patella reflex, or a gland such as the salivary gland.
As for simple muscle reflex are basic to any physical examination when motor nerve or spinal damage. An organism's reaction time is the interval between the moment the stimulus is applied and the moment the response commences.
In saliva swallowing experiment, the subject was told to swallow its own speed many times, but when the subject tried to swallow a second time quickly, it was more difficult. This happened due to normal speed present in mouth and encountering difficulty on the second attempt due to a lack of saliva and ongoing peristalsis. Peristalsis, the muscle contractions in the esophagus, necessitates a pause between swallows. However, when provided with water, the subject effortlessly completed the task. These muscles need a break before they can work again. This shows that water does two things. It fills up speed in the mouth again and helps stimulate the throat muscles start working again, making it easier to swallow both water and speed into the stomach. Questions 1. Why is it difficult to swallow our saliva in rapid succession? Is swallowing a completely voluntary reaction? Swallowing rapidly in succession can be challenging because the muscles involved need time to reset between swallows, and trying to swallow too quickly can disrupt this natural rhythm. Swallowing is a complex process involving both voluntary and involuntary actions. While we can consciously initiate swallowing once the process begins, it's largely automatic. Questions 2. Explain the ability to swallow in rapid succession when drinking water compared to just swallowing saliva in your mouth cavity. When comparing swallowing water quickly to swallowing saliva rapidly, drinking water allows for a smoother process. This is because water is consumed in larger amounts, triggering a coordinated swallowing response. Swallowing saliva, on the other hand, happens more subtly and continuously, making it harder to do rapidly because the reflexes need more time to reset between swallows.
of this experiment was to measure reflex response times using a stopwatch. A subject was instructed to react as quickly as possible to an experimenter stopping a stopwatch by pressing their own stopwatch, while their reaction times were recorded. The result of this experiment demonstrated the feasibility of using a stopwatch to measure reflex response times. Based on the experiment reaction time decide, the time lapse between the experimenter and the subject action is measured for 10 trials. For the first 5 trials, the time lapse was between 0.2 seconds to 0.4 seconds, which was increasing. For the last 5 trials, the time lapse was between 0.2 seconds to 0.1 seconds, which was decreasing. The reason why the time lapse is different is because when the subject sees the experimenter's stopwatch, the subject receives the information and process stimulus. Then, the subject responds when sees the stopwatch stop. Therefore, how fast the subject reacts depends on the motor. This is called cerebral reflex. During this experiment, precaution steps are taken like making sure the subject and the experimenter start their stopwatch simultaneously to avoid errors.
Question 1. Is there any evidence that the subject improved with practice? Yes, time lapse for trial 3 and above shows that there is improvement as the time lapse no longer exceeds 0.3 seconds after trial 3.
Based on the touch reaction experiment, we observed and recorded the time delay between the subject and experimenter. The result revealed inconsistency in this time delay, attributed to various factors such as human time of reaction and sensitivity of the stopwatch. While the experimenter held the watch and touched the subject's foot simultaneously, their response was slower due to the time needed for information to transit to the brain. Additionally, performing 2 actions simultaneously proved challenging for the experimenter or response inherent require time. Sensation originate as signal from touch receptor in the skin traveling through sensory nerve to neuron in the spinal cord, then to the thalamus, which relay information to the brain. Some of the precaution steps are inconsistent pressure should be applied when touching the subject to minimize variability in the stimulus, and the experiment need to be conducted in a quiet and controlled environment to minimize distraction and could affect the subject's reaction time.
Conclusion: Spinal and cerebral reflex are distinguished. Swallowing saliva is considered as cerebral reflex, meanwhile reaction time to touch and sight are spinal reflex. Based on the experiments, the speed at which the impulses are transmitted to nervous system is 9.7 meter per second. The length of the pathway between receptor and effector is 2.2 meter. The overall experiment shows how reflexes work.